This is StratNews Global. I'm Amitabh. Revi. On The Gist, we're looking at the essence of the situation in Myanmar, the internal and external players, both regional and global. Joining us is Ambassador Gautam Mukhopadhaya. He's been India's envoy to Myanmar. Good to do an in-person interview, Ambassador, after a while. It's mostly been virtual. The situation in Myanmar and the turn it's taken now, I think you predicted it as a possibility because both sides are so adamant in their positions. You have the military junta and you have the other side which is calling the junta-led council a terrorist group. So is this something that you would expect to further deepen?
Yes, I think it's already a very, very deep divide. We should remember that in Myanmar has been under military rule since 1962. And when they relaxed the rule a little with the 2008 constitution, permitting a civilian democracy, what they had in mind was a president and a party that was more or less a president and party of their choice. And as you know, these were drawn from reformers within the military. And let me say that the period between 2010-2015 under President Thein Sein was a very exciting period, and it was actually in many ways a very progressive period in terms of political reforms, media reforms, economic openings, investment opportunities, and particularly diplomatic outreach because they reached out to the world.
But they didn't foresee this kind of situation where the president himself is replaced by a vice president.
Exactly. So no, in fact, even more than that, it was actually specifically meant to exclude the possibility of an NLD government led by Aung San Suu Kyi. And as you know, there are clauses in the constitution to guarantee that. One, of course, was that a clause that disallows her or disqualifies her from becoming the president of the country, which she sidestepped by the post of a state councillor and still a president of her nominee, her choice. But also the provision that 25% of members of parliament would be nominated by the Tamador, and the fact that any amendment to the constitution would require 75% of the parliament. With the 25% MPs drawn from the military in the parliament, that was guaranteed that that could be prevented and it would be a failure. In 2015, in effect, that script went out of course. For the Tamador to then countenance a second defeat meant rewriting effectively, rewriting the script entirely, risked marginalizing their power. And one of the things that I think we should recognize, talking about the polarization and the divide, is that, very truthfully, the Myanmar people are fed up with military rule. And in the 10 years that have passed, first President Thein Sein's rule and then Aung San Suu Kyi's government from 2016, a new generation has come up. An old generation has returned. People have tasted freedom, political freedoms, media freedoms, social media freedoms, economic opportunities that simply never existed in the past during that period of autarkic rule. And also a reconnection with the international community and the globe. That means, after years of, for example, not being able to learn English, people had learned English, people had connected with international audiences, they had forged partnerships. In any case, the ICT revolution had opened the whole world to them. So Myanmar has changed. I think for the public, Myanmar has changed. Military rule is for them. They would like to think of it as history.
So the civil disobedience movement is not going anywhere?
In my view, it is not going anywhere. I know they will face...
Not going anywhere, meaning it's not disappearing.
Not disappearing.
It's good.
No, it's definitely going... exactly. Not going anywhere. Of course, they will face very strict controls, maybe harsh measures, maybe escalation, use of more lethal force as things... So far, I must say, the Tamador has been, despite the violence, has been to some extent calibrated or measured. They haven't taken recourse to, deadly or widespread use of force. But you don't know, in a situation where hundreds of thousands literally are coming onto the street, there could be a miscalculation from either side. There could be a moment of panic, and things could easily go out of control. I think that is the the prime worry right now.
India now, I mean, for northeastern states border, Myanmar is the only ASEAN country which we have a land border with as well. India's position, we saw soon after the February 1st coup, the statement that came out, and then the Indian embassy after the violence at the end of February on the weekend, where it said it's worried. India's position, can you explain that in history in terms of how we have learned possibly from the mistakes earlier when we sided with the pro-democracy movement, with the 88, with Aung San Suu Kyi, and how that went wrong geopolitically?
So, India has a historical and civilizational relationship. We are neighbors in that sense between India and Myanmar. So I think one of India's concerns would have been always that, the 50-year period of military rule was an aberration in many ways, because it was a complete rupture of these relations that had been built up over 2,500 years.
Sure.
And in those 50 years, a country and civilization that was anchored towards a South Asian, Indic civilization in all respects, actually moved away more towards the east, both China and Southeast Asia. So I think continuity with Myanmar, economically, culturally, people to people, will be a very important driving factor in our overall considerations. This is not something that is often realized. I think a second consideration will be the fact that, when we took a very forward position in 1988, remember there was a very large expatriate Myanmar population in India who were politically quite active, who had the support of the political class in many ways. But also remember that there was the shadow, you can say there was the memory of the mass departure, the exit of Indians from Myanmar from 1962 onwards. So when the pro-democracy agitations took place, there was a kind of sense of vindication, a kind of a sense of, that the Myanmar will once again become the Myanmar that they knew. So there was a natural public as well as political excitement at that prospect. Rajiv Gandhi had just been to Myanmar in 1987. It was a kind of a failed mission.
Sure.
In trying to talk the generals out into a more, ordinary relationship. But I think there are other reasons as well. One is that we cannot, and as I said, as part of that effort to re-establish and redevelop that relationship, we have a large number of development projects, a lot of them oriented towards the people. The infrastructure connectivity projects tend to capture the imagination, but the number of capacity building projects that have helped the Myanmar people in just terms of dealing and making use of the new opportunities and economies that are available.
Sure.
So in order to keep those projects going, a lot of our relations with governments has to do with having a door open to be able to do the kind of things that we want to do. And I think those projects are another good reason why we would need to engage with the government of the day usually. I'm not saying this as I'm just giving a general picture of what are the. And fourth, we have a very large, close to 2 million population of persons of Indian origin who we cannot afford to allow to feel that they are being orphaned or abandoned at this moment. So there are various reasons why we need to maintain a kind of engagement or a presence.
And one of the main reasons would also be strategic, right? I mean, we're learning from our mistakes and China's inroads.
A very important factor is also our security concerns in the Northeast. So all these are there. And in 1988, what happened was we took a very forward position. Then we found that the democracy movement was suppressed. And then for the next, from 1990 to 2010, you had a continuation of military rule. And we had to redevelop and recreate a kind of trust and confidence with the Tamado, which I must say we managed to do very well. And I must also say that I think on the whole, we managed to ride two horses, if you like. We managed to pursue and develop our relations with the Tamado on grounds of their defense requirements, training, as well as supplies, as well as our security needs. in parallel with our development of our relations with the democratically elected government of the day. So we were able to do that remarkably
Now
successfully.
what happened?
Now we would not like to be able to sacrifice that. And one, again, important consideration that people don't realize, and one of the reasons why we are, I would say, obliged to deal with the military side of Myanmar, and none of this should be taken as a justification. I'm just giving an understanding of it. Is that, in Myanmar, the entire security apparatus, that is the police, the military, the border guards, even border area development, is all under the military. The civilian government of the day does not have any coercive power at all. So particularly when it comes to neighborly relations to do with security and related issues, everything from trafficking to smuggling to weapons, arms, insurgencies, and many other things as well, wildlife, trade, drugs, we have to deal with the military component. Unless and until the Tamado or the military, Burmese military, gets folded within a civilian-led government, this is the reality that we, at least all Myanmar's neighbors, have to deal with. Distant powers may not, have the kind of security and other economic and other stakes.
And they have the luxury of imposing these sanctions like the US is doing,
Which
even though it's very tough.
Not very effective.
Absolutely.
If they are targeted, they affect a few people. If they are blanket, they affect the whole people. So it's not been a very...
Again, Ambassador, in terms of the security relationship and geopolitical location of Myanmar, and explain to us both the Kaladan project and the port, both in terms of Sittwe, which is now operationalized according to our minister, how important that is.
Okay, before I just come to that, please let me just take one step back and we look at the international reaction. What we see is that the Western democratic reaction has been sharp, and it's understandably sharp because democracy is a very major, principle of their foreign relations, even more so after what has happened in the United States and with President Biden. So I think they have to, and by the way, this is a popular position in Myanmar. Right now, there is very strong support for international condemnation of the regime and of the military takeover and the emergency. The Asian reaction, by and large, has expressed deep concern, has talked about restoration of diplomacy, and our position is in line with that. From Japan to India, we have signed on to some collective statements, like Japan has signed on to the G7 and India has signed on to, Japan and India have both signed on to the Quad statements. But the Asian statements have fallen short of outright condemnation or describing it as a military coup. But I think that is primarily governed by two factors. One is, of course, within the ASEAN, there is a strong principle of non-interference in internal affairs, and that's generally true for consensus.
Which is the Achilles heel,
exactly.
Many would say.
Perhaps, yes. But also that there must be some room for engagement, because otherwise there is no room for dialogue, discussion, even engagement to, let's say, to be able to tell the generals that they have made a mistake, they have miscalculated, it's in their best interest to walk back. So just to cover that.
We come back to the ASEAN thing, but just getting into, the linkages and...
Right. So, connectivity has been a very major plank in our relations with Myanmar. I think the Kaladan project has a dual purpose. One is, of course, that it is an alternative in a way. Let's say, at the time that it was conceptualized, our relations with Bangladesh were not that good. And so this was an alternative to Bangladesh, to the Northeast, and particularly Mizoram was very keen on it because, as you know, with partition, the whole of the Northeast was deprived of an access and outlet to the sea. So Sittwe was going to be the outlet to the sea that Chittagong could not be, right? Since then, our relations with Bangladesh have improved. Transit and connectivity has also improved, and I think Bangladesh once again becomes a transit passage. But Sittwe's use is both for the Northeast as a kind of insurance or a secondary route. But I think we often tend to forget that Sittwe is also the capital of Rakhine, and the Rakhine is in many ways separated from the rest of Myanmar by the Arakan range. So actually, there is a very large consumer market that can be developed in Rakhine and down south along the coast up to past places. And there are a number of tourist destinations, Thandwe and so on, up to Chongtha, virtually up to the Irrawaddy Delta, which is actually within Irrawaddy province. So there is a very large, and this area is also, as we go further south, it's a less mixed and a more homogeneous population, both in terms of so-called Rohingya or the Muslim population, as well as the Buddhist population, as well as Rakhine and Burma population. So Sittwe is important as an outlet to the Bay of Bengal, but it is no comparison to Kyaukpyu.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about that.
Kyaukpyu is a natural deep sea port. Sittwe is a port at the mouth of the Kaladan river, which gets silted from time to time. The draft in Sittwe is nothing compared to the draft in Kyaukpyu. The Kyaukpyu is possibly, and the British knew this as early as the time that they were there, is probably the best natural harbor in the Bay of Bengal. So the strategic value of Kyaukpyu for the Chinese is multiple times the potential strategic value of Sittwe for India. But Kyaukpyu was not ours for the asking. It was something that never came our way. So this is something that we have to.
Since you brought up China and Kyaukpyu, now how is China involved or not involved in the situation in Burma? We know Senior General is very aware of and has criticized or taken stances against China because of the Arakan's rebels as well.
Yeah.
So how does that sit?
Yeah. Not only Arakan army, in fact, even before Arakan, there's the Kachin, which they support, the Kokang army, and the whole group that is called the Northern Alliance. Though the Wa and Mongla are not at war with them, they're also, autonomous zones that are very highly integrated to Yunnan, China, with very high, and almost entirely, ethnic Chinese populations. So, I think the Tamado and particularly the military as a whole have never been very comfortable with China. If you go back to their early history, it was the Burmese Communist Party, it was the ethnic expatriate Chinese. There have always been problems with China. There were the very large economic investments that became controversial, like the Let Padong Tong copper mine and the Mitsun Dam. These are still live issues. But on top of, so all this was there. On top of this, there's this whole strategic projection through the BRI and what is called the China-Myanmar Economic Corridor, which will link Yunnan to. So I don't think China was taken into confidence about this, though I think the military could very easily have assumed that they would get some protection and backing from China at the United Nations Security Council. Having said that, I think China itself was quite blindsided by this takeover. Their first reactions were very temporizing.
Cabinet reshuffle?
Yeah, cabinet reshuffle. And in fact, they were missteps in many ways. And I think China will try to extract the maximum it can in terms of strategic advantage for this. Greater isolate. But what China has to take into account also is that this military takeover is now being associated with support from China. And anger towards the Tamado is also being directed towards China. And it's very interesting that in many ways, the Myanmar's youth-led civil disobedience movement has now established ties with something called the Milk Tea Alliance.
Yes.
The Milk Tea Alliance, which is a similar youth-led anti-authoritarian. And in Thailand. And in the case of Hong Kong, the Chinese state, the state in Hong Kong. So there are alliances that have developed between, the agitation in Myanmar with Thailand, against the military there, and with Hong Kong, which is against the Chinese Communist Party, particularly there. So China is still, I think, trying to figure out its eventual position. And so you see, kind of search probes in this direction and that direction.
And for us, it is a setback. I mean, when we talked last, when you were in Manipur,
Yeah.
you did visualize it as a setback, considering all the movement. I mean, you had the chief army staff there, ushering the foreign secretary there, submarine projects, defense projects that were given. It is a setback, or do we have?
So China was also managing this dual track policy with the Tamado and the civilian NLD. In fact, they quoted the NLD quite a bit. Perhaps not as well as we did, but they were also managing, and they were quite happy with the cohabitation arrangement. It allowed them the best of both worlds, dealings with the military and so on, and we too. So China could kind of change its position tomorrow.
Can we?
In our case, you see, the fact is that the problem with this dual track strategy was that this worked so long the cohabitation worked. And
now you have to choose.
Now we are forced to, have to choose, not just between the NLD, because now we are talking about a popular mass movement and a military that is considered repressive and possibly in the minds of most of the protesters, something that they would like to put in the dustbin of history,
But is it leaderless because of the action they've taken against, say, the Aung San Suu Kyi?
Yeah, it is. I mean, if Aung San Suu Kyi had been free, or if she had been able to communicate with the world, she would definitely have been able to rally people around her. But now I feel that this movement has gone beyond Senior General Min Aung Hlaing, beyond Do Aung San Suu Kyi, and possibly beyond the NLD to become something even bigger. That we will have to wait and see whether this leadership is able to coalesce over a period of time, whether this agitation, protests last. And, we should bear in mind that in Southeast Asia, military power behind civilian rulers or right in front is the norm. It's not unusual. If you look at many countries, I think barring Singapore and Malaysia and perhaps Brunei, almost every country has the shadow of the military behind that. Now, in response to that, you have the shadow of the MTA, the Milk Tea Alliance. But overall, the constellation of forces is still in favor of some kind of military backing behind this whole idea of civilian order and stability and security.
So when you're talking about Southeast Asia, so are they best placed along with possibly India and Japan to influence any political outcomes in
Yes,
Myanmar?
Because, they are a very,
foreign ministry
correct.
Meet.
They are a very close community, number one. They have, within that community, they have different sort of shades of democracy and different shades of military or one-party rule. And of course, the main fact is that they are a community. They are a community of nations. They talk about themselves as a community of nations. They are a fraternity, effectively. So when the ASEAN is dealing with this, they are dealing with a family problem. And I think they are the best place to do that. In terms of leverage, I would say they don't have the leverage of China. If China were to tell the generals to walk back, I think the generals would have a big problem in their hands. If ASEAN were to tell them to walk back, perhaps not the same effect. Perhaps not the same definitely not the case with India. Maybe Japan has a little more influence because of its
development in aid
diplomacy and active diplomacy. But yes, it's for political leaders in ASEAN and in rest of Asia to see whether there can be a more Asian initiative towards this, or more broad-based Asian initiative towards this.
Ambassador Mukhopadhaya, again, thank you so much for your perspective. Really appreciate it.
Thank you. Welcome.
And you can support our kind of journalism. Just go on our website. Do also follow our social media handles on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. You've been watching The Gist on StratNews Global. I'm Amitabh Revi.